Nehemiah is one of my favorite books, quite frankly. It is a popular book for any pastor who wants to talk about taking on a project of any sort. It could be a church renewal, restoration, a building project. It is a book about taking on a giant, and that is how we traditionally look at it. However, the more that I have found in preparing for this series, which we are concluding today, I see that Nehemiah is a book of prayer. It's a book not so much about building a wall as building a people. And it's a reminder that when we pray, planning goes hand in hand. The book, it is a book of prayer. It begins with that communication to Nehemiah. This is what's going on in the city you've never seen, because your parents never saw, and your grandparents didn't even see or only saw it as children, because he's a child of the people in exile. It began with that report and a season of him praying, and then speaking in the presence of the king, and the king saying, "Why are you sad?" And he shoots a quick prayer then, and then appeals to the king with a very detailed plan as to what to do about it. When it is attacked, in our section of looking at the word attacked, he is praying often arrow prayers or very simple prayers. Lord, remember that. Lord, give me strength. And the same in terms of the work accomplished, when he was still having challenges there. Constant bits of prayer. And at the end, when the wall has been dedicated, and there's a time for national rededication, all of that, of course, is involved in prayer. And we see in this second part of the book, and this is the only section of the series on that second part, that it is all about building a people. It's not just a project. It's about rebuilding a people. Prayer is throughout this book. This is a book of prayer. And today we're going to focus on that section of prayer in part 2. This process begins in chapter 8, and we jump in for our scripture readings a little bit towards the tail end of chapter 9. But there's a long amount of prayer and discussion that goes into this. And we see this prayer of confession, which we call just a tail end, but there's more to it than just that. It begins with who is our God. It follows with know the restoring. And even as they confess and ask for God's mercy, they acknowledge God's character. Essentially, this is about who is God, who are we, what is our story, and what is the connection between us and God. It begins with who God is. This was not read earlier. This is from the 9th chapter, like I said, in verses 5 and 6. They are praying, and he is speaking, and he says, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made the heaven of heavens, with all their hosts, and the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. To all of them you give life, and the host of heavens worship you. You are the God, the Lord, who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans." He calls the people and says, "Stand up and bless the Lord your God. Bless the Lord your God from everlasting to everlasting. And blessed be God's glorious name." It begins with praise. That sets the tone for confession. It's interesting, that is where it starts. Not on, look how we have fallen, look how we have done wrong. Though that will come into the message. It begins with who God is, and understanding their failings in light of that. A fellow that was about a year or two ahead of me at seminary. He had an interesting career. He had been in the, I think for a while, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and then had been in Florida, or the other way around. But he worked, state-level investigation agencies for many years. But second career, had gone to seminary. He had taken his family and moved there to Decatur, Georgia. And remember, our work study was in the same department in the development office. And there was context for conversation with sharing growing up and faith not meaning that much to him initially. And having to grow up Catholic, but talking about the prayers that he had been taught then. Said then they were just words, but now I use them all the time because I know what they mean. I understand them. And he talked about one of the prayers of confession was, yes, Lord, I have failed in these areas and they're wrong, but I've offended you. And it says, once I get it and understand it, I love these. I actually, as a Protestant now, I'm actually using all of my Catholic prayers of childhood in the way that it is you, God, that we have offended. You are the focus, Lord. It's not even confessed, and it's easy to get affected to focus on ourselves, but the focus is on God. And I'm pondering this. I'm still left pondering this truth, that it really is important where we begin. Now, I believe I believe that prayer is just start honest, and I believe that prayers in short places, we often just shoot up these arrow prayers or these brief prayers. We have these moments of truth. We say, Lord, I should just realize about what I've done. Forgive me. I mean, I believe in those. I think they're very real and they're part of our walk. But I think that when we are in our habit of praying, like in church, the importance of let's begin with who God is, acknowledging who He is, and then we confess. And part of that is actually how our worship service is set up. The opening hymn is traditionally one of praise, and then followed by confession. It begins with who God is. And then as this prayer follows, this long section here, it reviews the history. Confession is woven into it. Lord, you provided, we failed. But God, you provided, but we failed. We're sorry. Confessing the sins of the forebears is the importance of knowing your story and the context of the larger story. Of understanding the stories of what's going on for us here today in light of the history of this church, as well as the larger story of faith, and I think even into the biblical narrative. We interpret our present challenges and we map out our future hopes in light of our past stories. This has led me to another question to ponder. What stories do I curate? What stories do I put out front? In thinking of some dealings with the group, this is a whole 2-hour background which I will spare you. But for years, focusing on the bad side of the interaction, it actually ended up very good, and I knew it ended up very good, but focusing on the negative dealings on the front end, and not realizing, wait, in that work with that group of folks, some positive things happened, and it began to change, and it ended on a really good note. The relationship ended on a good note. What story am I keeping up front? How the Lord worked and moved me to a certain place and moved them to a certain place, or just the negative start? What stories do we keep in front of us? Positive ones, and you need to own the positive and the negative. I'm not saying don't own the negative, but what story do you keep in front? It's important about knowing our story. And then there is the large section of confession, and that was what was read today. And even then, it's done in the context of God's mercy. And in the midst of all of that is a reminder of what you have done for us, O Lord, and we're grateful. We have failed. But here they are truly confessing. Saying again, you've given us so much, but we were disobedient. We rebelled, but you have been faithful. You may have heard the formula about confession, about calling it sin, calling it forgiven, and calling on the Holy Spirit to change us. This is a time that they own what has been done wrong themselves and those who have gone before them. They're calling it sin. They're acknowledging ultimately God's forgiveness. And they're seeking the work of God to change them. All of this is around the building of that wall. And it had many meanings. It meant for them safety. And where they were living is long as they played nice, no one was going to mess with them for the most part, but it meant playing nice by somebody else's standards and always keeping your eyes open. Having a wall means safety. It means power. A town that is walled versus one that's not walled. It says everything about the town, about the power of the town, and also it gives them, quite frankly, an economic advantage. Puts them on the same playing field with other fortified towns in an area that has a lot of travel. For them, building a wall was a symbol of a comeback and a restoration. And the building of the wall was a process ultimately to build a people. Now, this day and time, that phrase, build a wall, can be kind of dangerous. It has a lot of many connotations. And often you want to say, what do you mean when you say that, building a wall? Well, let me just be very clear. I'm talking about it in the context of Nehemiah. And it was important to build a wall because more than that, just the wall itself, God was building a people. And part of that meant their confession, acknowledging what God had done and going forward. I pondered this image of building, and this quote from C.S. Lewis came to mind. So here he uses a house analogy. I want to bear with me a minute. Let's listen. C.S. Lewis said, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. And at first, perhaps you understand what God is doing. God is getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. And you know these jobs need to be doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, God starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably. And it does not seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that God is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. Throwing out a new wing here, putting up an extra floor there, running up towers, and making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage. God is building a house. God intends to come and live in it himself. Nehemiah is a book of prayer. It is a reminder that prayer and planning go hand in hand. And through this prayer of confession we have today, we sing that God is not just building a wall, but building a people. And in this process they acknowledge who exactly is our God. They remind themselves of their stories and what stories they will keep in the front. And as they confess, they acknowledge God's mercy. Now, I've pondered this in light of today, and one thing I'm just going to admit, I really thought by now, in November of 2020, we as a people would be much further along. Just call it naivete. You want to shake your hand and go, oh, bless your heart, Jones, that we thought that. But anyway, I thought, quite frankly, we would be further along. That we would not be masking, that by now we'd be back to 2 services, and we'd have a full choir up here, and everything would be back to something. And just shake your head and go, bless your heart, let's go, okay? But I really thought it would be different by this point. Continually, I'm reminded that really we're still in the midst of the challenge. It's just another chapter. And that recovery is going to take a long, hard journey when true recovery begins. And I'm reminded that it is a process, and that even now, even doing November differently than I thought we would be doing in November, that God is at work